Hello YouTube. In this story time, I'm going to be detailing the entirety of my training history. And it's a video that I actually already made on the channel. But I realized that I didn't manage to actually carry the message that I want to share with you guys, because when I think about it, the time I spent lifting and the lessons I learned are summed up in three main points, and the three main points were completely absent from that previous video. So I wanted to remake it. And of course, since the video was only 5 minutes long, I can't have that now on the channel. It has to be at least 40 minutes. So I'm going to make sure to explain to you guys everything I went through and all of the mistakes I did and all of the lessons I learned, because I think that I have something to share with you. Something that I've realized I never really mentioned, and that the channel could potentially lead you to believe. And I want to make sure that this doesn't happen. So I'm not going to tell you right away what it is, but you'll see that as I detail the months and valleys I went through as I progressed, you're going to start to understand the point that I'm trying to get at here. So the big picture was this. I started training when I was 14, which is really early. A lot of people start much later, in their teens or late teens. And what triggered my passion for lifting and really stirred me towards actually starting this was that I was really, really small. And by that I mean that at the time I was below 5 feet and I was around 100 pounds. And I was starting to become a little bit scared because all of my friends were growing around me rapidly and I wasn't. And I started telling myself that maybe that was it for me, because in reality, I had a growth spurt, quote unquote, between 13 and 14, where I grew like 3 inches. But since a big chunk and portion of my family is very short and the other is very tall, I had hoped that I took from the tall side and I was going to continue growing. But I was almost 15 and I was starting to think to myself, okay, there is a chance that this is my height. Like, I'm going to be 5 feet and I'm just going to be just like the other dwarfs from that side of the family, where, yeah, sure, we can fit in airplanes just fine, but besides that, good luck reaching for the pot of jam upstairs. Like, it's not possible. So I was starting to realize that I had to find a different way to get bigger, because there was no way I was going to live in that small body for the rest of my life. So I started training. And the funny thing that actually triggered me, and I literally mean triggered me to do that, is that I got beat in arm wrestling by a friend of mine who happened to be a girl and Asian. I mention Asian because she was very skinny and fair and the type of delicate lady that you would never think could do anything physical. And in reality, it was true. She was extremely weak, and yet she pinned me. When that happened, I told myself, okay, this is not acceptable. It's toxic masculinity, right? Which arose within myself, and I was like, I just got beat by a 15-year-old girl. This is not okay. I need to start training. No matter what I have to do, I'll do it. So I just jumped the guns and started doing what I could find in mangas, animes, etc. Because a lot of young teens, especially in the US, your motivations to start training were Arnold Schwarzenegger or Stallone, or maybe old comic books. And so these were the models you followed. For me, I didn't have access to all of that. My life was, and still is to a big extent, manga and anime. It's the type of media I consumed. And so I just copied what these guys did. And in these type of mangas I was reading at the time, the characters would do push-ups and sit-ups, etc. So I tried. And I mean tried, because at the time when I tried to do a push-up, I about died. I couldn't do a push-up, it wasn't possible. I vividly remember in my classroom going to PE and having to do some resistance training stuff and not being able to lift my legs, meaning that we would all be on the floor laying, we had to raise our legs. I couldn't do that. The muscles of my core were so weak that I was I was physically incapable. I would shake like I was possessed, but nothing happened. My legs wouldn't move. And I truly realized at that point that I was much, much weaker than the average male. So when I started training, I started doing whatever I could, meaning that I did girl push-ups on my knees, and I did crunches where I did like 1/4 of the range of motion, because if I went lower, I couldn't get up. And this is all I did. And I mean it when I tell you that at the time, a 5 or 10 minute workout was all I could do. After that, I was completely petrified. My muscles were completely cramped, And I just couldn't do anything more than that. And I had to recover and do it again. And my recovery was terrible when I started because I needed 2 or 3 days to recover from that pitiful workout. And this is already a moment where I want to take a break and explain something to you, something that a lot of people don't get, especially on this platform where you're supposed to progress super fast and get a 300-pound bench in 2 years, etc. And you're being shown examples of extreme types of either genetic monsters or outliers who do not represent the majority. I was on the other camp. I was an outlier in terms of genetics, but it's because I was extremely weak and my body was frail. For me to do that was all I could do. I couldn't do anything more, meaning that to me, at this point in my life, 5 minutes of doing girl push-ups and sit-ups was an optimal workout. If you had put me underneath a bar to bench or a bar to squat, I wouldn't have gotten the bar up. Some people tell me it's not possible. Yes, it is. I couldn't do one push-up. A 40-pound bar would actually staple me. A squat bar would actually staple me. Maybe a deadlift would work with 45 pounds, but even that, I would have to bend to grab the bar. I can tell you that I didn't have the mobility for that. So, at this point in my life, this was the best training I could do. And that's not even mentioning the fact that it's the only thing I could do. And I think you're starting to understand where I'm getting at here. The idea of optimal training is great. It truly is. I spend a large portion of this channel preaching it. The problem is when you stop looking at facts and reality for what it is, and you live in a dreamland where everything needs to be optimal and everything can be optimal. In real life, this is not the case. And the vast majority of your workouts and time spent training will not be optimal. And you have to accept that. There is no point in always trying to be perfect because that type of mindset leads you to inactivity. This is actually a great moment where the sentence and the phrase, paralysis by analysis actually applies. This time it works. You will always get better results if you do something. And at the time, I had realized to myself that if I wanted to make progression, I needed to just do something. And so I did. And you might be surprised, but this is what I did from the age of 14 to the age of 17, where I only did that. And here again, you could tell me, okay, maybe for the first few months, you were weak and you had to do this, but 3 years, like this is unoptimal. You can't argue against that. Well, wrong. I will argue against that. Because you see, the progression I made during that period was extremely impressive, at least for my standards, and two, was in line with what I could do. Meaning that for the young heads out there, gyms weren't really a thing back then when I was young, at least not for minors. So it was all I had accessible to myself to be able to train. And on top of that, as I said, I really progressed a ton because during that time period, I went from 100 pounds to 140 pounds. That's 40 pounds of gains. And yes, I went through puberty during that time, but the weight I gained actually showed on my frame, meaning that I managed to escape the fate that a lot of young men who grow very fast have. Because yes, I grew. This is something that I was surprised by as well, because I thought I was screwed and I was going to be 5 feet for the rest of my life. And I actually grew a 4 foot over the span of 3 years. So the genes on the tall side of the family decided to just manifest, I guess. And it surprised me, and the conspiracy part of me also wants to believe that lifting had a part in it. It's like my body was telling me, okay, well, you do nothing all day and you play video games, so you don't really need to be tall, you're not going to be physical, so you can just be short. And then I started training and it was like, oh, okay, you've decided to actually use your body, okay, here, get some growth, like get some size. And I just spurted, I actually grew a ton. But I think the physical activity I did during that time also guided that growth, because I didn't end up being gangly or extremely skinny like I could have been if I just didn't lift. And this was done, as I said, during the span of 3 years with only calisthenics. And I started doing some more advanced stuff. I started doing some back stuff, some dips, some more advanced type of abs. I was obsessed with abs back then. And this is another lesson that I want to share with you guys. Obsession sometimes trumps optimization, meaning that someone who is completely insane in the brain and trains a body part all the time, even if they don't train it properly or with the good methods, can still outdo someone who does things properly. Because I was possessed at the time. overdose of manga. I was doing abs every single day for an hour. And I know this sounds like a lot. I tell you for a fact that this is what I've done. And I remember going to a type of gym with a friend where it was like a tryout, and us doing a workout where we were at the same level, meaning that he was skinny like me and we could barely do a few dips. And then he wanted to do some abs at the end, and we started. And after 5 minutes, he got up, and I was like, "Where are you going?" He was like, I'm done. The trainer said 5 minutes. And I told him, well, I want to do at least another 25 minutes. And he didn't get offended, but he didn't understand why I would need so much time. But what it showed me at that point was that me training abs so much had made me extremely strong. Keep in mind that 3 years prior to that, I couldn't even raise my legs in a leg raise. Now my abs were really endurant and strong. And to this day, I still benefit from that, meaning that I still have a full six-pack that I don't really train anymore. It's just there because I paid the dues for it, and muscle never really goes away as long as you stay active. So this is a lesson for, again, the optimized, oriented mind out there. You might do something stupid in the past, but if it doesn't result in injury, it might actually be a good thing in the future, and you might benefit from it. And I also I look back fondly on these years when I didn't know anything, because this was when I was at my purest. I knew nothing. Because, yeah, I was doing things and it wasn't proper, but you have to learn how to walk before you learn how to run. And this is another pitfall of the optimization mindset. This is not realistic. Again, it's not something that you can ask people. You are speaking with hindsight, meaning that it's as justifiable to say that I or anyone should have been training optimally from the start as saying to someone who is now, I don't know, a professional car driver that they should have been as good when they started, or they should have had the same practice or discipline when they started. Well, if they had had it when they started, then they wouldn't have had to start in the first place. They would already be good. It's very important to hammer that mindset, especially in novices' heads, because if you wait for the moment of perfection to start, you're never going to start. If you wait to be ready to start, you're never going to start. Stop waiting for the stars to align and just start to lift. Do push-ups like I did. I am where I am today because I started doing push-ups on my knees, and it carried forward. And I truly want to impress that message on you. It is essential. You will encounter those people who tell you, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that. Well, yeah, maybe, but with ifs, like we say in my language, avec des si, on mettrait Paris en bouteille. With ifs, you can do whatever. You can rewrite the history of the wood. Your history and your past is your past. Be proud of it, embrace it. This channel in big proportion exists to guide novices so that I can save you some time. But I refuse to be responsible for that time period where you're going to start. I don't want to be the guy that steals this from you, because these are going to be your fondest memory of lifting. I almost guarantee you that. And you should experience it, that moment of just doing things. And whatever you do, it just feels good. It feels amazing because you're starting something that you can feel in your bones is going to be with you for the rest of times. Don't let science and programming ruin that for you. It's the reason why also my novice program is more open-handed and not super heavy on programming, is because you need to give some freedom to people, for people to breathe. And some people like me needed more time to breathe than others. So I spent 3 years on that, and I don't regret it a second. If I could go back and force myself to be optimal, I wouldn't do it, because this was the time where I forged my discipline. I'm sure that if someone had actually taken me under their wings and showed me the way, I wouldn't be there today, because I would have become complacent. By doing things myself, I actually built a strong mind, a mind that actually made me able to build a strong body. So this is what I did. And at some point, I realized that calisthenics were becoming limited and I needed to get weights. So after what I actually call my de-wimpization period, where I actually built the mind of a warrior, of someone who trains every day and who doesn't complain about his life, I started lifting dumbbells. And I remember when I actually went to buy those dumbbells, I was 17, because I bought what is called a dumbbell luggage. It was like a packaging thing that was on sale, and it was 50 pounds. 50 pounds is nothing. Nowadays I can curl 50 pounds. But back then, 50 pounds was all I could gather and muster. I could barely move that thing. keep in mind again, it was a luggage with like rolling wheels. It wasn't like I had to drag this thing, but it took me all of the energy of my body to get that thing from the place where I bought it to my house, and the stairs were a nightmare. But when I finally got that, I installed that in my bedroom. My bedroom looked like a gym because it was weights and a bed. And this is when the second portion of my training started. I started lifting weights. And this was my first contact with weights. And when I started again, I was incredibly weak. I was curling 5 pounds, I think. And this was all I could gather. Back then, before that, actually, I'm lying. I did lift the pink dumbbells. I'm sure we've all done that as teenagers. And the pink dumbbells were a challenge for me. They were 2 pounds. The pink were 2 pounds and the blue were 3 pounds. And I would do curls and shoulders with it. And it was tough. Like, it was high intensity training. Again, keep in mind that yes, technically on paper, doing push-ups and lifting pink dumbbells look like really non-intensive training. But for me back then at 140, it was really intensive. So when I moved to dumbbells, my body responded a lot, right? Because even though calisthenics did make me grow bigger at some point, as I said, it becomes limited. And this is the moment where I needed to actually take it to the next step. And so I started doing dumbbells. And my obsession with lifting became more and more marked, meaning that at that time, at that point, I was training 2 hours a day. And you can see a trend here. I've always been someone who likes lengthy training sessions. I love training. And I respond better to volume and to lengthy sessions, as I said, more than I respond to intensity, even though I need the two. So I've always gravitated towards longer sessions still to this day. And so it's something that I've done. And I was building muscular endurance as I was doing that. And so my sessions were from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. I would go home like clockwork at 5 p.m. and I would train. And I would do that every single day. I didn't have a rest day back then. At this point, I hadn't taken a rest day in years. I was training every day because training finally made me at peace. It made me relaxed and it made me love myself for once. And I couldn't let go of that feeling at all. So I was training every day. I was also training for football because I had started a sport. So I was sort of torn between lifting as the passion that it was for me and lifting to get better at the sport I was trying to get good at. And I was lost at that time in the sense that I had started lifting, as I said, as a cautionary measure to not lose my life to any random girl that would decide to just arm wrestle me. And when I got to 140 and I was still growing, I was realizing that I've already accomplished that because I was already strong enough to beat any girl in arm wrestling, at least the ones that didn't train. And I was starting to look bigger, but I wasn't satisfied. I wanted more. And so I continued without any direction because I was progressing. And this is also the funny story or moral of that parable is that by taking things slow and not being optimal and not jumping with the big guns and the big weights right away, I managed to make my linear progression period last for what essentially was, if I actually add up all of these things, a grand total of 6 years. This is unheard of. Like, most people don't progress steadily for that long. And yet I did. Why? I was taking things slow. A lot of people don't realize that if you progress from an arbitrary number of 0 to 200, if you do it fast, it could take you 6 months, but then you're stuck here and the progression is slow. If you take your time and you triple, quadruple the time it takes, you still progress from 0 to 200, but you accumulate much more volume in the meanwhile, much more training experience and much more muscular stamina. And yes, it was slower, but so what? You still got to the end point at the end of the day. Bodybuilding is a game of patience, never forget that. And I'm glad that I did it this way because it taught me patience. So this crazy routine of 2-3 hours of dumbbell training lasted for another 3 years. And I went from 140 to 170. And at the time, without knowing it, because I didn't know what it was, I was already experiencing with supersets because my entire training was a giant set. I would do one exercise and another because I had realized at that point that waiting in between was just a waste of time. And so the only moment I would rest was at the end of the giant set. I would take a manga, usually Hajime no Ippo, and I would read for like 2-3 minutes, then I would get back to it. But I was so measured, I was so dedicated that I actually had a timer because I didn't want to rest too long, even though that wouldn't have killed me at all. And so that was my life. At the time I was doing cheat curls, it's when I started doing cheat curls because it was easier than normal curls. When I tell you that I didn't know what I was doing, but at the end of the day, again, cheat curls worked. All of my bicep size that I have is cheat curls because it's the only exercise I did for like 6 years. And this also shows, again, it is a clear sign that an obsessed mind can do a lot. An obsessed mind can also get injured and tear a bicep, but it never happened to me because I was always low in intensity. And so I did all of that rows, I did a ton of presses, a lot of stupid stuff with my dumbbells that I loved so much. And this lasted me, as I said, for another 3 years. And I went to 170, as I said. So at this point, I am 6 years deep in my training and I gained 70 pounds, between 60 and 70 pounds. And I look completely different. Of course, I'm transformed, as most people will actually go through that type of progression will. But as you can see, this was a very slow progress. And this is the second big message I want to share. After the idea of a more patient and a more patient-oriented type of progression, I also want to share what a realistic evolution can look like. Because YouTube Fitness bombards you with image of teens who gain 50 pounds of muscle in a year. And that's, of course, not realistic at all. One, because they're taking drugs, or two, because they just perma bulk and they just get fat. For me, it was just lean mass. And by lean mass, I mean still fat and water, of course, but that looked amazing on my frame because I was taking my time. No one was behind me, pushing me in my butt and telling me, oh, you have to be faster, you have to do this, you have to do that. I was going at my own pace. And this resulted in a very healthy progression. At the time, I detailed that in my diet video in the description. I wasn't eating a ton, I was eating just enough to grow. And I was growing. My body was very slowly putting on mass, very high quality mass, and all was well in the best of worlds. That was until I moved to a different country, because when I moved to that new country, I discovered the gym, so a real gym, but I also discovered, or at least started to apply myself more, with YouTube Fitness. And this is when things started to go sour a bit, because I had managed to get to a certain level on my own with no help whatsoever. And now I was taking advice from people who I considered to be more knowledgeable. And they were, but it didn't mean that their advice applied to me. What ended up happening to me in that gym is that for the first 6 months, I continued to do it my own way, but it wasn't working anymore because my attention was divided. When before my attention was laser focused on my training methods that I invented, this time I was just doing a few machines and then, oh, let me try this and let me try that. And I wasn't progressing at all because I wasn't applying myself. I was just trying everything. And this is when I realized, okay, you need to be serious about this. Where can you get resources to know how to train properly with barbells? And this is when YouTube Fitness opened its arms. And for me and for a lot of young lifters, the types that we resonated the most with were powerlifters. I'll make, and I know I've been teasing this for a long time, but I'm guaranteeing you it's going to come eventually. I'll make a video about powerlifting at some point on this channel and explain the reason why it dominates the sphere of YouTube Fitness. But at the time, the reason why was because the best option out there were powerlifters to follow because they were the smartest out of the entire crowd. And so I did. And to be fair, I made tremendous progress, just like anyone who tries compounds. And this is where I want to go back on the idea of optimization, because something tells me that if for some reason I had access to barbells early on in my training, I wouldn't have managed to get as much from it as I did later on, for multiple reasons. One, I would have lost all of that progress I did on calisthenics and dumbbells, which represented periods of time where my body evolved in a certain direction. If I had just done compounds, I fully believe that I would have lacked and lost these periods. And secondly, I jumped on compounds with a body that was already built. The motion patterns were already there. So the first time I deadlifted, it's not impressive, but for me it is, I deadlifted 2 plates easy for a few reps with really good form. The first time I benched 150. The first time I squatted 185 with also really good form, because my body was already used to that. And so it allowed me to just immediately go in. I didn't have to learn the lifts or have a transition period. I managed to just jump into it and make great progress. So I actually progressed extremely fast on that. And this is when I as I said, started following more powerlifting pages. And I progressed, I want to say, from 170 to 180 really quickly, maybe within the span of a year and a half. I don't have a clear memory of that back then, but this was also the time where, for the first time in my life, I had access to the food I wanted. And so this is also when I started, stirring away from the direction I had taken before, where you could just say I was doing a very, very slow conservative bulk. And now I was starting to let go a bit more. I was eating a bit more and my body was growing faster and responding to the compound movements as well. The problem is that this type of gains and progression, as I explained previously, is not realistic, meaning that I was growing too fast. But I wasn't realizing it because I was in love with the gains and I was in love with the strength. I was getting stronger very, very fast. And a lot of people can actually recognize themselves in that. It's addicting and you don't want to let go. Problem is, I had lost sight of what I wanted because, as I explained, I started to get bigger, then to get better at sports, but now I wasn't playing any sports and I was already big. So what was driving me? Well, that is a question that young me back then never asked himself, and therefore I didn't have an answer. And because I was lacking the answer, I was lacking in direction. I encourage you to find your answer as soon as possible because it's going to prevent you from that type of adventure. You're going to eventually be stirred away from things if you don't realize what you actually want in the first place. So my realistic evolution sort of stopped. I was growing really, really fast, but not in the direction that I needed to be growing in. And it's just escalated. I detail that again in the diet video. From the age of 21 to 23, I went from 170 to 240. By seeing those numbers, there's only two things that come into mind. Either I took a bunch of drugs or I was fat. Well, it's number two. I was fat. And I was fat way before I reached 240. By the time I was 220, I was already fat. 210, I was already fat. What I didn't realize is that the more fat I was adding on, the stronger I was becoming, of course, but the less apparent it was body dysmorphia in reality, where I just wanted to get bigger at any cost, and I didn't see myself as fat. Like, if I could go back and look at myself in the mirror, I would have just seen a big guy. Nothing in my brain was telling me, hey, you're not building muscle anymore, right? This is just fat. I would have said, no, I'm actually getting bigger. Look at myself, look at my arms. Well, no, it was fat. And it took me watching old pictures of myself to realize that, wow, I had a double chin, I had a gut. How did I let myself go like this? I wasn't like this before. What happened to me? Well, what happened is, again, I started putting progression first and losing sight of why I was progressing in the first place. And I lost the plot. I also was training like an idiot because I was following powerlifting principles, but I wasn't a powerlifter and my diet was horrendous. So these years, on paper, look like the years where I progressed the most because I literally gained 70 pounds. But these are the years I regret the most too. From 21 to 23, none of what I did was adequate. I created problems for myself that I had to deal with afterwards. And I wish I had just stopped and just progressed slowly the way I always did. I wished that from the age of 20 to the age of 23, I just gained like 15, 20 pounds. Be at 190, a solid 190, and kept the progression going. You see, I firmly believe that it is always better to progress like this than progress like this, because this is not sustainable. At some point, you're going to do this. And the issue is that once you do this, good luck building back momentum to do this. Whereas the guy who's slow, he's still going. Le lièvre et la tortue, the rabbit and the hare. The rabbit and the hare. The turtle and the hare. The turtle wins at the end because they're consistent. And at some point I realized I needed to stop. There's something needed to change. And that was at the age of 23 when I made a massive difference and I started a very slow cut. I told myself, okay, you don't want to reproduce the same mistakes. Don't suicide cut. Just take it slow. And I did that because I had an experience with a suicide cut that went really poorly. So when I was at like 235, 230, I slowly went down to 210, very slowly. It took me 2 years, actually. And these are the 2 years before I started the channel. And during those 2 years, I was starting to be rebirthed. I was starting to pay attention to programming. Finally, I was questioning the things that I was being told on YouTube Fitness. I was developing my patience that never left me in the first place, that was taken away by my own poor habits, was starting to restore itself. I was taking diet more seriously. I was pushing away things that were bad for me. And also, I finally realized that what I loved was bodybuilding. And again, you could tell me, well, you are a certified idiot. It took you 10 years to realize that you were in there for physique. Yeah, it did. For multitudes of reasons, but for me to be open about that to myself took a long time. And I know that for a lot of people it's the same, where it's tough to find this as a way. One, because YouTube fitness wants you to think that it's not a good thing and it's vain. And two, because especially if you started training for sports, you are always in that functional mindset where you always try to justify the reason why you're doing a certain lift to yourself, and you try to explain why, and you say, oh, it's because I want to get better at this stuff. No, you're lying to yourself. You just want to get bigger, and that's perfectly acceptable. But being able to actually be true to yourself like this will avoid a lot of problems for yourself, the problems that I ran into. So that's when I was starting to accept myself. And as I said, at the age of 25, I had went down to 210. I wasn't lean, I wasn't shredded, but it was a 210 that was now sustainable, manageable, and could allow me to renew my progression, because progression, as I said, took a big hit. From the age of 23 to the age of 25, it stagnated or went down because I was so occupied with fixing the mistakes I did before. See the problem? I was doing this, then I did this, but the problem is that this meant that at some point problems arose that I had to take care of, and I was here. So I lost on progression. If I had never done that and lost all of that time, I wouldn't be where I am today. I would be further. But again, there's no point in dwelling on the past. What happened, happened. I just hope I can avoid you the same mistake. Be patient, take your time. That is very important. Your evolution will be realistic because you are a real human. But at the end of the day, what matters is the years that compound. It's not progressing super fast in 1 year. It's how much you progress for every single year. And this leads us to today, where from the age of 25 to today, I just stayed at the same weight. But paradoxically, it's also the most progress I've ever done, and both on paper and in physique. And it's the years that I'm the proudest of, beyond my starting years that I have the most fond memories of, because I finally managed to tame my demons, to tame my body dysmorphia, and to realize, okay, yes, you're at the same weight. Yes, your measurements are going up very slowly. Yes, your strength is progressing slowly, but you're progressing everywhere. And if you keep that up, you're going to look amazing. Don't let your demons talk you into doing stuff that are like kamikaze level again, just to have like that satisfaction of, oh, I'm slightly bigger, quicker. No, this is not the way. The way is patience. The path is a path of patience. And this is where I discovered the concept of final program, where my program is not moving anymore. It's perfected. It has enough mechanisms that it just adapts continuously. The idea of sculpting the body instead of just adding stuff on top of it. This is what I used to do. I sculpted the body when I was in a pure mindset, and then at some point I just started slapping slabs of meat on top of it and saying, okay, it's bigger so it's better. No, it wasn't. It was shittier. Now I've started to actually sculpt. I went back to my old ways. I have reconnected myself with the me that I want to be. I focus more on weak points, and I'm just perfectly fine with slow progression because at the end of the day, it's progression. And I've experienced enough stalls and regression to know that any amount of forward momentum is what you want. It's what we all need to build up to, because this is what at the end of the day amounts to greatness. Not yo-yos, not spirals, not waves, but steadiness. And I'm going to leave you with that. So I hope I was clear with the message I was trying to actually convey to you guys. And the hope that I espère, which is again a French word because I don't remember the English one, that I actually managed to inspire in you, because most likely the story I just told you is a story that you're going to be able to tell people too in the future. And I hope that it's going to be not just as good as mine, but even better, because you're going to avoid the mistakes that I did. And you're going to actually be able to look back and think, wow, I started there and look at where I am today. This is amazing. And this is a feeling that at some point you will have. So if you're still the you that is very small and who thinks that they'll never be big, keep in mind one thing. I'm at I hope, the middle part of my story. You're just at the beginning. So give it time. Don't be impatient and you'll get there as well. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.